Hi everyone, we're just getting everyone into the session this afternoon. We're just going to give it another minute or so before we kick off. If anyone's got any issues with audio, etc., just pop something in the chat, but hopefully you can all hear me okay. And we'll, as I say, we'll just wait for a wee minute and then we'll get started. I believe we still got some people coming in to the waiting room.
We do, yes. They're just coming in just now.
Okay, dogs. Okay, Lee, do you think we're okay to start just now?
Yeah, I say go for it.
Go for it. Okay, dogs. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We're expecting a few others to join us, but I'm sure they'll be able to catch up. But we've got plenty of time to chat and have a bit of Q&A towards the end of the session. So just by way of introduction, I'm Suzanne McQuade. I'm the Senior Manager of the University's CPD Centre, and I'm joined today by my colleague Paul Rafferty, who will take us through some of the key themes emerging from this year's Skills at Work report. And we're also joined by Nicola McCormack from Skills Development Scotland, and we'll be having a wider discussion on what the findings may mean, and particularly what they may mean in practice. So this year's report brings together perspectives from both employers and employees across a range of sectors and organisational contexts, providing a broader view of workforce development challenges and opportunities. So in today's session, we'll also explore some of those themes that were coming through from the findings, particularly around workforce confidence and readiness for change, access to learning, digital and AI capability, and also evolving skills and careers pathways before opening up a discussion on the implications for organisations, the workforce, and the wider skills landscape. So workforce development continues to be a major area of focus across all sectors, but organisations are operating in an increasingly complex environment. Rapid technological change, workforce and demographic pressures, evolving role requirements, and wider economic uncertainty are reshaping how organisations think about skills and future capability. However, at the same time, significant investment continues to be made in learning development, digital capability, and workforce transformation. And one of the key questions we wanted to explore through this year's research was whether that investment is translating into greater confidence, adaptability, and readiness for the future of work. So this year's Insights activity was designed to bring together multiple perspectives on workforce development and skills challenges. Alongside our employer survey, we introduced a separate employee survey to better understand workforce experiences directly. And we then complemented this with an industry roundtable discussion to explore some of the emerging issues in greater depth and to understand how they are playing out across organisations. Together, this data has provided not only insight into skills priorities, but also a richer understanding of the barriers, some of the opportunities and experiences shaping the workforce today. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Paul, who will take us through some of the key findings.
Thanks, Suzanne. I'll just take control of the presentation. Can everyone still see that on the screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
That's good, great. So, as Suzanne already introduced herself and me, I'm Paul Rafferty. I'm the CPD Operations Manager, and I just wanted to give some context around what the surveys looked at, but also what they're experiencing right now in Scotland. So you'll see on the screen there, with our surveys, we looked at both the employers and the employees, but in terms of the employers, the interesting feedback we got was that 9 in 10 of those Scottish employers were reporting skills gaps within their workforce. And that actually represents an increase over last year. So that was, well, maybe not surprising, but interesting to see that that's grown from last year, from when it was 8 in 10 employers, which was already significant enough in terms of skills gaps. But what makes it particularly interesting is that for the first time with this data, we incorporated that employee perspective inside the report alongside the employer data. And what we got was quite strong alignment. So 9 out of 10 employees, so not the employers, the employees this time, recognised that they themselves currently have skills gaps. And if you take this further, there was 14% of those that described those gaps as significant barriers to performing effectively in their role. So what we're finding is that skills pressures are now being experienced not just at the organisational level, but it's more and more by the employees themselves, and they're recognising that. They're becoming aware that the employees themselves are becoming aware that the pace of change in the workplace is accelerating. I'm sure we've all felt that to a certain extent with the boom in digital transformation, AI adoption. There's the change in service models or even evolving job expectations that are happening right now. And it seems to be particularly exacerbated by this AI and digital transformation that's going on right now. But I think the key takeaway from this here is that skills challenges aren't just isolated or particularly focused on certain sectors or organisations, but they're increasingly being experienced across the wider workforce, and the employees themselves are recognising that pressure there. So while the skills challenges are now being recognised much more widely across both organisations and the workforce, I suppose the question is which capabilities are becoming most important for organisations to prepare for that future change. And what we found in the surveys was that there's broad consensus on the future direction of priority skills for the Scottish workforce. So both the employers and the employees agree broadly that AI and automation is one of the important priority skills. Leadership is certainly something that comes up quite a lot when we're speaking to organisations and employees themselves. And then data literacy, and these will be the most, or in their view, the most important core skills over the coming years. It is useful to note, though, that what we've found is that employers tend to place greater emphasis on that AI, automation, and leadership capabilities. So that's probably due to the fact that areas such as digital transformation are seen as such priority organisational strategic goals. I know that most organisations I've worked in, there's always conversations going on in the background about digital transformation and improving the capabilities in that areas. Employees also, interestingly, fed back that there tends to be a bit more importance to areas like collaboration, well-being, and creativity. So yes, there's broad alignment on the priority core skills that we see coming over the next few years, but there are significant disparities, I would say, in how business critical skills are valued. What this means, though, is that there's an exciting opportunity here for organisations and their people to have closer dialogue to try and align these workforce development goals or organisational strategic goals for the betterment of not just the organisation, but the employers and the employees to get that synergy. In terms of where the priorities differ, I can expand on this a little bit more. So there was some interesting differences that emerged when we look at how those skills are prioritised. So employers place greater emphasis on AI and automation, as I touched on there, and they are closely linked to organisational performance, productivity, transformation, and in terms of that leadership, project management, and business acumen, it's all about transformation and responding to future business challenges. Whereas, as I've touched on just previously, the employees tend to place a bit more importance on that collaboration, well-being, and resilience. And that's more about opportunities that support their own development and career progression. So that's where this difference starts to show its head. It's not just about improvements to skills that can help serve the organisation. Employees are increasingly thinking about how can I improve myself in terms of not only my job performance, but my own development and career progression. It's important to note, though, that these findings don't necessarily suggest disagreement, because there's clearly priorities that are being recognised in terms of skills development and future workforce capability that align, but it's just these different perspectives and priorities that are shown ahead every so often. And then I suppose it's interesting or useful to note that it's obvious that employers would naturally focus on organisational capability and that future readiness, whereas an employee is more likely to think about how, as an individual, they can remain adaptable, develop their careers, and then navigate that change successfully. I think the opportunity for organisations here is how they bring these perspectives together. So by looking at creating workforce development strategies that support that organisational objectives, which are, of course, absolutely key, but also try and marry that with employee aspirations. And what we found from the information in the surveys and the industry roundtable is that organisations that are more likely to improve engagement, retention, and long-term workforce resilience when they're able to effectively marry these two together. In terms of the barriers to development, so while employers continue to recognise the importance of workforce development, what we did hear is that many are finding it increasingly difficult to create the conditions needed for that learning to take place. And what we actually found particularly interesting was, for the first time in our research, the lack of time workload pressures emerged as the most common reported barrier to that staff development, whereas in previous years it had always been the funding constraints, which had been the main challenge. Not that that's went away in any sense, but it's been slightly overtaken at this point. Employers also highlighted difficulties releasing staff from operational duties, which is understandable. I'm sure we've all been in that position where you have time constraints and pressures around your work, and it's hard to be released from those operational duties to go and do some training. And then there's also the challenge of identifying training opportunities that are considered relevant, also affordable, and deliver meaningful value, because a lot of the times as well, for an organisation to justify releasing staff for that training, they need to see what that return would be in terms of not only for the individual, but for the organisation. So I would say that the findings suggest that workforce development, it's not simply a question of investment. Increasingly, it's about that capacity that we've touched on. So whilst organisations definitely, from what we've heard and when we've been speaking to them, value learning and development, it's about how that competes with the priorities and day-to-day operational pressures, and how that can and then impact on their ability to act on those ambitions and how they work around that barrier. So to move this forward and touch on how you can adapt to future change, there was another key theme that's important to mention, that was the confidence gap across Scotland's workforce. So when we were talking to employers, we were finding that they were generally optimistic about their organisation's ability to adapt for future change, whereas the employees themselves were not necessarily sharing that confidence. And in fact, over half of the employees reported low confidence in their own ability to develop skills needed to adapt to future workforce or workplace changes. And that, I think, is quite a significant or important finding. Because when we talk about future readiness, it's not just about whether training exists, it's also about whether employees feel equipped, supported, and capable of adapting. I suppose a likely contributing factor here would be the type of development opportunities that are currently being accessed. So one of the areas that we questioned in the survey was how that internal training or training in organisations was carried out. And what came back was that many employers are continuing to rely on in-house training and learning from colleagues. And that is definitely valuable. We all have an element of that in our roles, but it can be highly role specific. So it may help myself to learn a very role specific training course to do my job better, but it's not always creating a visible sense of career progression, external recognition, or future development for that individual. So it's coming back to that mobility that we're talking about in terms of career progression that they might not be seeing. And without that, employees may continue to feel uncertain about that long-term readiness that we've already touched on in terms of changes coming to the workplace. So organisations may feel ready for change at leadership level, but if the wider workforce lacks confidence, that's probably going to create challenges around workforce adaptability and organisational resilience. And you can understand this because at leadership level, you might have that overarching view of all the skills and people that you have inside your organisation and have that confidence. You know, you see the new technologies coming in, you see the new processes coming in, and you feel confident that the organisation can navigate the storm and get to that place where it wants to be. But for an individual, that could be quite possibly anxiety-inducing to be in that place. So I think while the organisations are recognising the need to adapt and invest in future skills, what the findings would suggest is that translating that into meaningful workforce confidence and preparedness is proving more complex in practice. So another finding from the research or the surveys is that while employers and employees both recognise the existence of those skills gaps that we've touched on, we're not always agreeing on the best ways to address them. So employers are taking a relatively mixed approach, with nearly half of them prioritising training existing staff. But there were also many who said to us that they would look towards recruitment or outsourcing to quickly address those capability needs, bringing someone in to fill the gap, maybe even on a short-term basis, perhaps. Whereas employees, what they fed back was they show a strong preference for development-led solutions. So nearly 3/4 of them believe that skills gaps should be addressed through some form of external training or recognised qualifications. And that does point to a potential disconnect, if you want to put it that way. So naturally, organisations are balancing that immediate operational requirement, whereas employees are looking for maybe a longer term approach in terms of opportunities that support their career development and progression within that organisation and further and beyond in terms of professional development. What I would say is that there's an opportunity here to bring these perspectives closer together, to try and work between the organisation and the individuals to support that workforce development that looks at both the organisational capability and matches the employee's ambition and hopefully brings about a better outcome for both. Another theme that came from the surveys and the industry roundtable was the importance of viewing workforce development as a longer term strategic priority. So the positive finding is that employees are highly motivated to engage in learning. That's something that we were seeing across the board. And also we were seeing that with employers as well and interested in engaging in this. For the employees, the strongest motivations we got were improving performance in their current role, progressing their careers, and also increasing their own confidence in future job security. So that's indicating that the appetite is clearly there. What the industry roundtable surfaced was there is an important challenge around retention. So a number of the employers that we spoke to reported that yes, it's good to be able to invest in their staff, but what they were seeing was that employees would come to the organisation, they would have that investment and then often leave after 1 to 2 years, which poses a problem for them in terms of that cyclical nature of bringing new people in, training them up, investing, and then losing them again. And that understandably creates concerns about return on investment at an organisational level. But when we delved into it deeper, the findings suggest that training on its own may not always be sufficient to support longer term retention and progression. So the employees are feeding back that they increasingly want to undertake learning that feels meaningful, externally recognised and connected to genuine progression opportunities. And that points to a broader strategic shift in a way. So organisations may need to work with them more intentionally to think about this workforce capability building. And that means looking at creating pathways, learning pathways that are visible, flexible and aligned to both the organisational need, but also to that employee ambition, as we've spoke about. Or ultimately, organisations that get this balance right are more likely to build not only workforce capability, but also stronger engagement, that adaptability, and then that longer term organisational resilience, because the individuals will feel valued as well, and they'll be more likely to stay there at that point. And that's where the partnerships between employers and training and education providers play an important role in supporting that more structured, flexible and future-focused workforce development. I'll hand you back over to Suzanne now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. I think that was really useful just to give us a flavour of some of the insights that can be read in the full report. And it gives us some interesting things to kind of pick up on in our discussion. Quite a few things there certainly kind of sort of resonated and echoed some of the conversations myself and others have been having with stakeholders, whether it's employers or those who are kind of embedded in the industry and providing support. What seems to be quite striking is that awareness of workforce challenges is high and investment in skills still continues, of course, but there are obviously some tensions around confidence, access to learning, capability and readiness for change. So before we begin the discussion, Nicola, if you're happy to unmute yourself now, and yourself, Paul, of course, it would be great if you could briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little about your role at Skills Development Scotland.
Yeah, hi there. So I'm Nicola McCormack. I work for the sort of employer engagement part in Skills Development Scotland, and I work for a team called Skills for Growth, and we're a group of 7 employer engagement executives who cover Scotland. We all have quite large regions, and the main part of our role is to go out and deliver skills reviews with businesses, and they're quite unique in a way because we work with the leaders, but we also work with the workforce, and I think that's where I've got, you know, certain insights into businesses, because we do go on site and speak to people individually and in groups. I've got certain insights that maybe aren't there elsewhere. What I will say is I have a feeling that my input is definitely going to reflect a lot of what's come out in the report and what Paul was talking about. There's so many things that I was just like, yep, I totally agree with that. It's certainly stuff that I'm seeing. So yeah, so that's the main part of my role.
Okay, thanks very much, Nicola. And that's interesting to hear. And I think with what we've done with the research this year is trying to get that kind of multiple perspectives in terms of employers, employees and wider stakeholders, and having you join us for the discussion this morning, just kind of adding to that and really kind of helps amplify those findings. So in terms of one of the strongest themes from the report is this gap between organisational competence and workforce competence. So from your perspective, would you say that is reflective of what you're seeing more widely across employers and just generally in industry just now?
Yeah, there's so much to say here. I'll try to keep to the point, but it definitely does reflect what I'm seeing. Obviously, bear in mind I work with a variety of sectors when I'm out delivering these reviews. Digital systems and AI capability, obviously now we know they can support any business in their team, whether it's manufacturing, office-based, you know, your old blue or white collar roles. A lot of it's down to those that are leading the business, and I suppose their understanding of digital and AI and their comfort levels. I suppose them understanding not just the capabilities and the desire to adopt, but what it's going to mean for their processes, for the people in the roles, for the skills required, and possibly where some businesses are struggling. And I know there's a lot of systems being brought in, but I suppose unless those that are using them are given that support, and it's got to be tailored as well to support their role, the systems, it's not going to be utilised fully. And I see this in areas like HR, accounts, project management roles. The systems are there, but they're just not being fully supported for the individual. And that can affect people's confidence, certainly in what they do. I would say capacity, I suppose, and willingness to adapt, and as well as how they learn and work. So these differences have got to be considered. And I know there's a lot been done in education to keep up in terms of developing new courses. There's a rapid pace of change at the moment. And there's also a lot of individuals sort of independently going out and upskilling themselves, and that can make it difficult for the employer to take a more coordinated approach. And I think Paul touched on quite a lot of that. But there's a lot been done to support the changes in terms of the sort of public sector support. And obviously I'm regularly referring to places like the DPMC, your Digital Process Manufacturing Centre, NMIS, the National Manufacturing Institute. Things like apprenticeships can always provide the structure, but those support agencies that I mentioned can also support that confidence level for the employees when they are going through the process, and helping them to sort of understand, you know, what they need.
Thanks, Nicola. I think that's really... Sorry, on you go.
I was just also going to say there's quite a lot of, in terms of AI and digital, there's quite a lot of apprenticeship frameworks that do fit into that. And at the end of the session, we will have there's a slide where we've got a QR code for the apprenticeships.scot in terms of giving employers and I suppose employees that confidence levels. It explains fully, you know, what things are involved. There's so much support there, and the QR code itself will take you into a national manager who can support you.
And I think that's kind of part of maybe what we're seeing in terms of that kind of mismatch with the confidence and the capability piece. It's sometimes awareness of what support is available external to organisations, including from organisations such as yourself. And we do have the QR codes at the end of the slide deck, so everyone will be able to get access to that. And I think the other thing that's interesting is just understanding that the confidence and capability, they're not necessarily the same thing. And I think sometimes there's a communication barrier as well. Employers, employees, and maybe having slightly differing priorities, but for very good reasons, of course.
Yeah.
So without me taking up too much time, sorry, on you go, Nicola.
That's what I was saying. That's exactly what I think I'll talk about that and sort of later on. Is the communication is key.
Yeah.
It's key to anything. If you've not got that strong communication links there, it's not going to breed confidence. But there's so much support out there in terms of the places I've mentioned. But you've also got tools like the Scottish AI Playbook, which can support businesses to give them that confidence to see that there's a pathway towards reaching where they want to reach. But it's also they're very, you know, it's about getting trust. I think it's about getting trusted resources and support as well, to support businesses, because as we know, the support system, the skill system can be a minefield for employers, and that's partly where my role comes in as well, is to sort of make that easier for them, just to simplify the process and help them to have the confidence to identify what support's there and where the gaps are. And there is so much, as we know, there's so much support there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's two things there around sort of demystifying what things mean in reality, but also supporting stakeholders to kind of navigate the system and the support and so on. Paul, I mean, from your perspective, you obviously participated in our industry roundtable, and you've worked with myself and Lee to analyse the data from the surveys. Was there anything particularly that kind of stood out to you around that disconnect between organisational readiness and individual confidence in terms of future readiness for change?
Yeah, I think it's very much what we've all touched on here in terms of it's not necessarily, there's confidence and there's capability. It's not really to do with capability, it's more individuals' confidence. And I think it's, like I touched on, it's easier maybe at organisational level to look at all the skills you've got within your organisation, individuals, and feel assured that as a team you can pull it together. But on an individual level, it can be anxiety inducing when you're part of a big change in an organisation. I'm sure we've all been there, where you've been in an organisation that's undertaken some large scale transformation. A lot of the time you don't know what that means for yourself as an individual. So it's about taking everyone on the journey with you at all levels. And that can be crucial in terms of that communication that you touched on as well, and how that's translated at all different levels. Because for the most part, I'd imagine it's not the capability, it is just that lacking in confidence. Because I know in particular myself, I feel like for the digital and AI side, it feels like it's accelerated rapidly. I'm sure people that were actually in the field of AI have been involved with it for much longer, and we're just seeing the more mainstream aspects of it. But even in your own personal lives, the usage of AI and digital technologies is exploding for a variety of different reasons. I mean, people are on ChatGPT, Gemini for everything these days, for anything. And I think that when you're in an organisation and you're trying to take something that's such a wide-ranging technology with such massive application, how do you get that to the place that you want to be in terms of an organisational aspect? But also, I suppose, you do see conversations about, is this going to change my role? Is AI going to take away my position? And that sort of stuff. So if an organisation's looking at transforming itself or moving in a certain direction, it really is key that communication and that career trajectory is translated well for the individual.
Yeah, Yeah, no, I think that definitely speaks to a lot of what we're hearing from organisations just now, isn't it? And I think that transformation piece that both you, Paul, and Nicola refer to, it probably speaks quite well to one of the kind of biggest barriers that we've found coming both from employers and employees in terms of access to learning, and that being around time and workload. So if there's so much transformation happening, the workplace is a very busy place, you know. So Nicola, it'd be interesting just to hear from you, you know, in terms of how significant a challenge is that becoming for organisations, you know, reduced time and increased workload to support staff to engage in learning.
Yeah, I think that was a sort of barriers to workforce development. That's sort of come under in the report, right, in saying that. I suppose, well, one of the key messages, first of all, that when I go into employers, I share with employers is that staff development and upskilling, it shouldn't be treated as an add-on. It needs to be built into the role. It needs to be embedded in the role. And I know it's easy for me to go in and say that to employers, but that is the best way to ensure that it is embedded and it's put into practice. When there's a structured support for people, they've got protected time, where appropriate, if it's accredited training. I know, Paul, you talked about a lot of on-site training, and a lot of businesses I go into, they're already delivering the training, but there's no structure, there's no accreditation linked to it. There is no badge for those mentors or those people that are supporting the people coming through.
No recognition,
and that's
isn't
no
it?
recognition. And also for those people, there's no recognition, but for the people coming through, they're unsure of where they're at and where they're going. And that's where things like obviously your apprenticeships and also in-house accreditation, which SQA can support businesses with, I regularly refer through to them, where the apprenticeship frameworks don't fit. That allows a business to basically accredit the stuff that they're already, put accreditation towards the stuff that they're already doing, which is already really valuable. And a lot of time with some of the, particularly in some of the manufacturing engineering areas, it's very, very bespoke to what they do. It's not a general skill. The apprenticeship support can help with that, where they get the theory, you know, with the training provider or college, but they get this bespoke stuff in the workplace. But to me, it's having that structure. They're more likely to engage, they're more likely to learn, and they're more likely to want to take on new challenges and responsibilities. And I've got to say, I am seeing employers finding better ways to manage workloads and creating space for development. And obviously that makes sense, because obviously improving skills, making effective use of systems and AI makes things more efficient, it makes things more productive, but it does need that continuous investment from the leadership. And also a lot of the time when I go out, this sort of wider change management approach comes in. That's key. I think, as Paul had mentioned, you know, not everyone deals with change at the same pace. Some people really struggle, particularly with digital and AI coming in. I've seen places where someone's extremely experienced in the role, but that input of information and changes has actually not just affected, you know, it doesn't just affect the way they take in information or the way they, you know, do their admin part of their job, but it's actually affected their confidence in a job that they're really experienced in. So it's taken that into, you know, account. Everyone learns, everyone's got different learning styles, they've got different levels at which they learn, but they've also got different desires to take on, you know, levels of AI and digital, and it's got to be appropriate to the role. It's got to work for the business. And I suppose that's part of this a wider skills system, you know, SDS and the partners that we work closely with, is to help by coming in, by me linking them into appropriate partners, to help them to see that and it will be short-term pain, taking that a step back, but also evaluating where they're at and how they're going to move forward. And with that, they will get that long-term gain. You know, they will be able to see the woods for the trees, because a lot of the time they can't as leaders. And I think as a collective, we're definitely wanting to help employers understand, you know, how they can be supported. And I think the alignment is there, but as I said, it's a minefield for employers. But also making that space, I think that was one of the other questions, making that meaningful space for learning. And a lot of the time it doesn't need to be that disruptive. It can be a lot more straightforward. I've got into places where, You know, it could be an unused office if someone's out of the office. It could be putting a baffle board or a board in front of someone's desk. It could be getting people to work from home so that they've got that space to have the mindset to learn. And where appropriate, that needs to be protected, because you can't be half in your job and half out of your job and learn. Both are going to suffer. And I see business leaders, certainly the ones I work with, you know, when they bring us in, they want, that's what they want, that's their aim. And I suppose our role is to support them to get there.
It's kind of thinking about things a little bit differently, isn't it? But it's not an easy you know, balance to find in terms of marrying and addressing immediate operational pressures, you know, with that strategic longer term focus on workforce development as well. It's incredibly complex, and I don't think you know, anyone thinks otherwise.
That's definitely something that. Sorry, I've just came in there, but that's definitely something that we've seen in the industry roundtable, was that for a lot of organisations, like you touched on there, it needs to be protected and it needs to be part of the role and built into it. But that is easier said than done, and a lot of them have come to us and said in these situations that, particularly when you've got people like frontline and operational roles, releasing them for that work can have significant downtime in their organisation. So that is obviously an immediate priority, but also for a lot of these roles, they'll have very specific training and compliance needs. So compliance training that they need to undertake. So what we're finding is that naturally will be prioritised in terms of development. If there is time that they can give them, it will be to do the training that is, or the qualification, whatever it may be, that is absolutely necessary for them to continue doing that role. And then I think what we're hearing is that, unfortunately, at times the skills side of things then becomes the kind of leisurely development, the stuff that they would wish they could do, but they just don't feel they have the time.
Totally.
But you did touch there on how you're hearing more employers finding different ways, and we did hear that as well in terms of looking at online learning, blended delivery, where they can go away for a day and do it on campus and then do the rest elsewhere. Or even looking at exploring shorter learning interventions, so things that are done in shorter periods of time that can allow them to achieve the goals that they want, but without having a massive impact on the organisation. Because we can be talking here about organisations with 10 people who don't have the time to release en masse. But we did encouragingly see that organisations are increasingly recognising this and also trying to find ways, much like you spoke about there, even novel ways, working from home for a day or two so that they can get that training done.
You've also got things like augmented and virtual reality, and I know that's going to be coming in the future, but you know, if you go to the DPMC, there are ways of training, and you're talking about like physical manual jobs of training people up, you know, where equipment or machinery has been used. And I know that is potentially in the future, and it's harder for a small business, but there is opportunities there for businesses to use that, and that's where the likes of the M&Ms can actually take the business owners through the procedures and show them this is what could be done. Here's a pathway towards it. It's an option. But I've seen companies looking at their shift patterns, looking at downtime, and for example, the factory, looking at where, you know, even if there's, so for example, a regular breakdown with a machinery that stopped them working, well, instead of them sitting, I don't mean sitting idle, that sounds really, I don't mean that sounds a bit patronising, but instead of them not being able to do that, let's use that and get them together to see what we can do with that time. So it's trying to come up with I suppose it's ways that work for that business. It's got to work for the business size, the sector and the nature of the business, and also obviously taking into account, you know, the people within the business and their sort of learning styles and their needs. But but I do agree, you know, Suzanne, what you were saying, it can be really difficult for businesses when they've got deadlines, they've got timescales, you know, stuff's got to get out. But sometimes it does, and that's where the skills review does allow them to take that step back, and it gives them recommendations in terms of this is where you could. You've also got like the SMAS that will come in and do process reviews, because a lot of times people are working really hard, but are they working as smart as they could be? And it's not the individual's faults, but it could be to do with the process, you know, that could be quickened up, that would free up time for them to develop and progress. And that's ideally where digital and AI and automation are going to support. It's going to take away a lot of that manual stuff, back office stuff that's taken up a large part of people's time. and free them up to do the stuff that's maybe a bit more exciting and challenging, without actually taking away people's roles.
Yeah, I think that headspace is really, really important. Apologies, I'm very conscious of time, and I think as we all suspected, there's so much here we could dive into, and you know, the conversation could last a lot longer than what we've got scheduled, and you never know. On the spot here, we might do some further sessions similar to this, because there is quite a lot that we could actually dive into a wee bit more. But no, I think, you know, that's been really, really interesting, and thanks very much to both of you, to yourself, Nicola, for joining us as our special guest, and also to Paul. I think there's clearly still some big questions around how skills development is experienced, and also how it's embedded as well. So we do have about 4 minutes left, so really keen just to kind of open things up to the audience. If you've got any questions, whether that's for particular people on today's panel, any sort of reflections, any sort of comments that you'd like to add, feel free to pop that. I think it's the chat, or is it Q&A, Lee? Keep me right, please.
Ideally chat, but Q&A is fine. I'll keep an eye on both.
Okay. You can, of course, get in touch with us if there's anything that springs to mind after today's session, and we'll be happy to have a chat with anyone. Okay, looks like everyone's been pretty shy. Fair enough. There's a lot, I think, for people to take in and digest. That's understandable. And of course, there's still the full report to access as well, which adds a lot more detail on to what we've been able to discuss this afternoon. So, you know, thank you very much for joining us today. And as I say, particularly to our special guest, Nicola, it's been great to have your contributions to that discussion, and interesting just to hear how that kind of correlates with some of what you're kind of actively hearing. You know, someone who's kind of out there in the industry and supporting and working directly with businesses, leaders, and people in those organisations. It's very clear it's no longer just about recognising that skills gaps exist. They're always going to exist for various reasons, of course, that makes sense, but it's more now around how do we ensure that investment in skills development translates into something that's meaningful in terms of capability, confidence, and also opportunity for organisations and for their people. We hope today's session has provided some useful insight and reflection, and that the report itself helps contribute to wider conversations around workforce development and skills planning. The Skills at Work 2026 report is now available. There's a wee QR code on the screen that you can scan, but as I say, we'll contact everyone who's joined us today, and we'll provide a copy of the slide deck as well, so you can get your hands on those QR codes. So thank you again for your time and engagement today. We really appreciate it. And Nicola's mentioned a kind of few services that are available through Skills Development Scotland. So if you would like to explore any of those options available, there's some QR codes on the screen there. And I know Nicola would be happy to signpost people to colleagues and teams across the organisation who can provide you with that expert steer that you might be looking for. So thank you very much again, everyone, especially for taking time out of your own lunch, I'm sure, and hopefully you get a wee window to get a bit of a break before you get back hard to work. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.